Welcome to Sharing the Mddl, where recovering perfectionists, overachievers, and anyone in the middle of a struggle can come together to learn to embrace the messy middles of life. I'm Lacey, your fellow middler and guide, whose claim to fame this week is hitting a whopping 50 followers on TikTok. Big deal for me here. Today we're joined by Dr. Seema Desai, a proud wife and mother of 2 young children, a certified professional coach, speaker, and author of the newly released children's book. Though no longer seeing patients, Seema is also a general dentist who dedicated her years in medicine to serving the geriatric population of Austin and the surrounding areas. Seema's coaching practice is primarily geared towards supporting women experiencing checkbox syndrome, which I know I totally relate to. This idea of lacking in purpose, you've done all the right things, checked off all the boxes, and you were told that you were going to be happy, but you're not. She absolutely loves helping professional women and moms create a life that is meaningful and feels successful to them while excelling in their roles at work and home, which is always much harder than we think it's going to be. So welcome, Seema. Thank you for joining me.
Hi, Lacey. Thank you so much for having me. I feel like just the name of your podcast resonates with me so much.
Good. Well, that's kind of my first question. You know, when I talk about the middle, I often find people have this visceral response of like, oh, this is my middle. So for you, what is that middle? What kind of popped out to you?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many middle moments that I can think about. But, you know, it's interesting. I saw a post on Instagram I think it was last night. And it was talking about how with every time you level up, there is an inevitable death that happens, right? And that I feel like when I hear you say the middle, I feel like for me at least, the middle is defined as that clinging on, that attachment to what is, even though it logically, you know, it doesn't serve you anymore, it's not working anymore, but your ego is like stuck to what's familiar, right? So that like resistance to let go and that feeling of like, I'm stuck, I'm in between things, right before you finally just either can't let go, can't hold on anymore, or you choose to let go and allow that death to happen so that you can be reborn into a better version.
That's so interesting that it's almost like it's like a safety blanket that you don't want. You know what I mean? Like, we don't like to be there, but it's known and it's safe, so we stay there.
Yeah.
Oh, that's really interesting. I haven't heard that kind of perspective yet. I really like it. The idea here is that you're going to explore a specific middle moment of your life, let you kind of take us on a little journey of a middle moment you want to share.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I want to say that I feel like I have middle moments every single day, but that wasn't always the case. For many of us, we are kind of programmed to be on this default, like, I want to almost call it an iOS, like I'm totally not a tech person, but that's what kind of we're at now. So we're kind of running on this default iOS, right? And I remember for me, it was, you know, you mentioned me working with people who have checkbox syndrome, and I had that myself, to where, you know, I did all the things, right? Like I was this good Indian girl that listened to her parents, and I didn't date, and I, you know, got the good grades, and I went to school, and I went to college, and I got into dental school. And when I did date, it felt like I was disappointing my parents, right? Like it was, but I found someone that I thought would fit the mold for them. And luckily I am so in love with him. So it worked out.
Oh, that's awesome.
I know it's very easy to make it sound like, you know, I kind of settled, but I didn't. So that worked out. But my point is, I found myself, you know, very discontented and almost on a daily basis, but I wasn't necessarily aware of the discontent. And I kept telling myself like, well, it's just the office that I'm at, right? Like it's the patient population, it's the staff, it's the location, it's because my husband's still in training and that's why he's so busy and that's why all these reasons why was justified for me to be happy, for not be happy, right? I of course am discontented because XYZ.
So you are like searching for the problems because there has to be one thing that's wrong, kind of?
Well, yeah, I guess I never really thought about it that way, but I think I wasn't even searching. I just was like, all I was looking for were reasons why I wasn't happy, right? And and essentially blaming it on life's circumstances that we all go through. It's not like I had this unique life story that, was different than many women that I know, regardless of cultural background, and or even men. Let's open it up to that. But my point is, I had everything I was supposed to, quote unquote, have to be happy, right? I had the job, I had the degree, I had the husband. When I was discontented, I thought, well, let me just have a kid. That's why, I did want to be a mom.
Yeah.
I did, but the intention behind that was very different, right? Like, it was, this human will make me feel whole, and therefore I will now be happy. Of course, I was unaware of that, and I found myself having had this child and being in a really dark and lonely place. So navigating out of that, I know this show isn't necessarily about navigating out of that, but started to advocate for myself slowly but surely. And I, through the help of, supportive family and, yoga and mindfulness and acupuncture and all of these things started to get better. And I still, after all of that, like after even feeling the lowest of lows, felt like, oh, well, I'm still not happy because, my kid has he's in the terrible twos, and that's why, like, da-da-da. Of course I'm, again, here we are back on the cycle. And one day I looked up and was like, this is just a bunch of hot air. There's no way that we were meant to live life just continuously dissatisfied. And when I went to start looking into that, I initially, like, we were talking about that safety blanket, and like when you start to sort of experience that death of the old you, I told myself, and I really did feel stuck. I felt like this middle of like, well, I'm not where I was necessarily. I've come out of it, but I'm also not where I want to be. And I don't know who that person is. I don't know what that looks like. And I don't have necessarily the resources to be able to create that because I don't know what I'm doing. And I remember telling my husband, like, I want to do things. I want to be somebody. And which is ridiculous. Right? Because, like, again, all the boxes were checked, and externally it would look...
Because you were someone.
Yes.
You were doing things.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So that was kind of that whole middle moment was an interesting... To experience it was one thing, and now to reflect back 10 years later, it's very different. So I want to just give listeners take it with a grain of salt, because perspective changes with time.
Can I pause here? I'm really curious. You said something earlier that I related to in a different way of being a good Indian girl. So like being a good girl has been really ingrained in me of like, this is how you are good. This is what you do and that kind of stuff. Do you think that was a piece of holding you back? Or masked what that person could be that you wanted to be?
I mean, on some level, for sure. At least initially, right? Because, you're supposed to go to school, and you're supposed to get good grades, and you're supposed to da. And I don't think, honestly, some of my family understands what I do now, but most of them don't. I don't think my parents really get it. And, so it's like bucking the system of saying, like, you know what? I'm not going to be being a dentist, right? That makes sense to everyone. They know what it is. They know what service you provide, and there's no question about it. But when you sit there and say, like, I'm not going to do this anymore, first of all, there's like all this time and money and judgment that people like you've invested, and other people are like, oh, why would you do that? But importantly, there's the other piece of it, which is like not understanding what you're replacing it with, right? So just feeling like I was being a disappointment maybe to other people's expectations more so than my own. Because I think for a while there, it was me saying like, I'm not being good. But after a while, it was like, no, I'm sick of being miserable. But now I'm not dealing with my own stuff. I'm dealing with other people's stuff and being at peace with the fact that they're not at peace with it.
Yeah. Well, when you said disappointment, I felt that in my core of being, because I just really relate to this idea of one, checkbox syndrome is very much get in general, but that idea of, but I'm doing this, I'm doing this, I'm doing this, I'm doing all the things that were expected of me, and I'm meeting those expectations, but I'm not getting where I want to be. So then how did you reconcile those two things? Where you were in this kind of cozy, we'll say cozy, I know cozy's in the right middle, to kind of that push of getting out of it.
I think for everybody, it's that cycle of change, right? Where you kind of have to decide. I wasn't consciously thinking this, but essentially what happened was I became so uncomfortable with the problem that the perceived discomfort of the solution was more comfortable, right? Like for a while it was like, oh, I know that's the solution is exploring maybe a different career or whatever it may be. One of the things that I did was I got a life coach myself long before I ever became a coach. I had a life coach, and that was incredibly helpful. So I mean, I recommend it. There's all this research behind why it's so effective. And I mean, CEOs and executives have used coaching for years now, and it's starting to become more mainstream in medicine, but it's still, we have so far to go. But anyway, that was part of it, the reconciliation, for sure.
Sorry, I had never thought of how much doctors and medical professionals need a coach. And that just, especially as someone who's working with lots of doctors right now, they could use someone to come in and be like, what about this?
Yes. Yeah. Have you considered, right? Like,
yeah.
Yes. For sure. I feel like we were already there before the pandemic. You know, the pandemic didn't create it. It just precipitated a lot of awareness around like, oh, we're really needing help, right? And so that's a whole other conversation.
If you haven't already, make sure that you are subscribing or following Sharing the Mddl for free on whichever podcast platform that you use. That way you can be in the know and get the most recent episodes right in your feed every single week. This way you know and we know when we're all in the middle together. That was kind of cheesy. But either way, follow, subscribe, and thanks for joining me in the middle. All right, so we've got your life coach, you're working with them. What did I really liked too this idea of the discomfort level of thinking about what is the least level of discomfort and going towards that almost. But what would you say was that moment that you got out of this middle? Is there like a defining event in your mind or a milestone? Because I think a lot of times, and you've kind of touched on this, you don't know that you're in the middle until you've reached an end.
Yes.
And when you're looking back like we are now and talking about it, do you have kind of an end that you can point out, or was it just a feeling? How does that look looking back now?
I think it was a little bit of both. Like, I feel like overall it was a very gradual shift, right? Like, it's micro changes and it's lifestyle changes and mindset changes that happen incrementally over time. One day you look up and you're like, oh my gosh, right? Like it. So I can't say that there was necessarily a defining moment, but I do remember when I, attempt to unstick myself was I had fallen in love with yoga when I was depressed because I tell people it saved my life. And so, I still have not, the universe has shut me down, but at the time I was trying to become a get yoga teacher certified, right? And I was, and so I'm still pursuing it. Somehow it'll happen when it's meant to happen. But I went and found a yoga studio and I was going to see about getting yoga teacher certification. And that person is also a life coach who turned out to be my yoga mentor and life coach. He was talking to me about what coaching is and all of these things. And I remember in the course of our conversation that was well over an hour long, he asked me like, what do you feel like, why have you experienced everything that you've experienced, right? Like there's kind of an all over the place feeling when you describe what's happened in your life. Why do you think that is? And just that simple question of what might be the deeper purpose here, I remember thinking like, oh, maybe I'm meant to, because I had actually started to experience these micro shifts that I just referred to when I was still practicing dentistry, and I would remember feeling things and thinking things and recentering and reshifting. I would drop into, fully scrubbed in. I wouldn't very aseptically like do a yoga pose to kind of reset my body to address like the shoulder pain or the hip pain or whatever, to then I could focus on the patient, right? And it was amazing. And I thought to myself, how come they don't teach us this in school? Like when you're becoming a doctor, how come they don't teach you these skills? And so that was one moment where I was like, maybe that's something that I'm meant to do, is help other people create this space for themselves that they don't know exists.
Yeah, I feel like in programs like that, it's probably self-care. And then I move on to the next thing.
And what is that?
I
mean, is self-care a cup of coffee? And then like, I don't...
It's a bath.
It's a bath.
That's what I mean.
It's not going to fix things, guys. Like, it's great to absolutely have your coffee and take baths if that's what works for you. But it's so much more than that.
So, and this is just me being nosy because I am very also interested in labels and like what we call ourselves and that kind of thing. Was there a moment where you were like, I am not a dentist? Obviously, you're a dentist because that's it. You know what I mean? But was there a moment where you're like, that is not my identity anymore? Has that kind of still stayed a part of you?
It's funny. The ego is a really tricky little thing, because when I was growing up, I was told you're either a doctor or you're nothing.
Okay.
Essentially, right? Like people like, yeah, you can be a lawyer, whatever, blah, 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 blah. You can be an engineer or whatever. But I mean, just the people that I grew up with, and my parents aren't in medicine, they're blue collar workers, and just that lack of security in terms of their identity and who they are and what they were able to provide, as compared to their friends who were physicians in the 80s who like made all this money that now is not the case. But I mean, it was a huge sort of thing. And so for me to identify with like, yes, like now I'm somebody because I have that title in front of my name, that was a really big thing. And I would, for years, a point of contention within my marriage was because my husband is an MD, and people would ask him questions about things. And I'm sitting here and I'm like, I'm right here. Like, you could have asked me, but you asked him. And it's about basic stuff, right? And it's like, still a doctor, guys. Like, but it wasn't necessarily wrong for those people to ask my husband. It wasn't a personal assault or anything, but my ego kept telling me, you're not really good enough because you went to dental school. Like, I actively chose to go to dental school. It wasn't like it was a choice to go to dental school for various reasons. And it's still, so to answer your question, it took a long time for me to feel secure with not being that. And I honestly, I still will feel twinges of that when people will just very, very sporadically, but I don't as much need that title anymore, or I don't need to be called that. I don't need to be, and when people ask medical questions, like, I can answer them, but if there's somebody there who wants to step up and fill those shoes, I'm totally at peace with it now, which is very liberating.
I love the idea of like providing life lessons. So like, this is a thing that I took away from this. So if I was talking to a friend going through the same thing, or if I could tell myself this when I was younger, what would that be for you? What would your advice in this kind of middle that you were in be?
I would say, it's just awareness is so powerful. Importantly, I always used to think this was a bunch of hot air when I would like see it on yoga studio walls, but it's like the whole saying of you are exactly where you're meant to be. I would think like I just never quite understood it until now, looking back, it does make sense, right? Like, we co-create our lives. And I think that concept in and of itself is, I think, my direct answer to your question is you co-create your life experiences. You choose your perspectives. And just the idea that there's more than one perspective to be had. I mean, accepting that without saying like, well, one is right and one is wrong, or one is good and one is bad. We all have the ability to see things from multiple angles. And the angle with which we choose to view the world will help us then determine what our next action might be, or thought, or whatever. And in doing so, we co-create what we're living. It's very easy to, and I'm not, downplaying the very, very real importance for things like therapy, and, people go through some very large traumas. And so I'm not discounting that, and not to say that anyone deserves to be mistreated or, feeling icky, but the ickiness for a typical person, I will say, even for me as when I will speak only for myself, when I was depressed, the ickiness is just a breadcrumb. It's just a breadcrumb. It's a signal that you can pivot if you want.
It's a piece of information.
It's a piece of information. That's it. And you and I were talking before we hit record, and you were talking about appreciating when things go right, right? Well, you can only have that deep appreciation when you have seen the other side of things, right? So there's a reason these things exist.
Absolutely. I mean, even for me and where I am right now, I have learned that if I just take 3 or 4 minutes and put the minor amount of makeup on, even if I'm feeling awful that day, I will feel so much more accomplished. And it's because I took that one action to make myself feel a little better. I don't care what I look like. No one sees me. I'm in a bed most of the time. This is for me, And so I think that's really important of like, I have that little bit of control and I can take it and do what I can with it.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, so often we're like, well, the government or the system, the healthcare system, the school, my parents and my family and da 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 da. Guys, we have so much power. So don't give it up. Like, yes, there's organizational shifts that need to happen, familial shifts that need to happen, but that change incredibly starts with each of us.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your story with me. I would love for you to tell people where to find you, all of your cool things that you're doing. Yeah. So take a minute and do a little plug.
Yeah, well, so Lacey, you mentioned me just having recently published a book. It's called Connected, Discovering Your Inner Guides. It is for kids. It's written in a way to be accessible for children, but whether you're 8 or 80, there's something in the book for you. It's really about navigating your emotions and, creating that awareness that I was talking about earlier to then go forward and actually create movement in life and, live a life full of happiness and ease and peace and joy, even amongst the stickier parts of life, which inevitably will happen. So there's the book. You can, I do workshops and master classes. I just finished one up I called it the Mama Doc Master Class, and that was really, really powerful. So likely we'll be putting more master classes on in 2023. So you can find information about my coaching and all the little events that I do on my website. It's drseemadesai.com, so drseemadesai.com, and I'm sure you're going to have this in the handles.
We'll put a link in the show.
Yeah,
notes,
and you can find me on LinkedIn and as well as Instagram at the Instagram handle is at dr.seemadesai.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for sharing the middle with me today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
As usual, thank you for sharing the middle with me today. Remember to check out my writings at themddl.com. That's the mddl.com. While you're there, you can sign up for the weekly newsletter to get a little bit more middle in your inbox each week. I am a one-woman show, so any bit of support means the world to me. I want the middle to be as accessible as possible, so I have several ways for you to support. You can shop the middle with some merch or my books, the Lacey Loves affiliate links and recommended products, Patreon for additional community and content, and I also just have a tip jar if you'd like to leave a tip. If you like today's show, also make sure to subscribe at your favorite podcatcher, share with a friend, and maybe even leave a 5-star review. Thanks so much to Lemon Music Studio for our theme music. It is literally called Sunshine, and that is certainly how it feels to me. Can't wait to see you in the middle again. Thanks for sharing the middle with me. As always, I hope you've been able to see a little bit of yourself in the story we shared today. Don't forget to follow, share, rate, review, and follow me on social media at Lacey Shares. You can always check out the Joyful Support Movement at joyfulsupportmovement.com and see all of the amazing goodness we have there, like No Shame in the Home Game, Pops of Joy, courses, resources, and of course, the Joyful Support Village. All right, now go out there and spread some joy.